Good morning. I'm Jim Zogby, and I'm from the Arab American Institute and also the Managing Director of Zogby Research Services. I'm here today to report on the findings of a poll that we conducted largely during the month of September of this year to get a sense of how Iranians viewed their newly elected government, what their expectations were, what their political priorities were, how they viewed their country's nuclear program, and how they viewed its overall foreign policy, especially the policy in the region. The poll was conducted entirely face-to-face, a random survey. It encompassed all parts of the country. Interesting thing was that there were very few demographic differences. And that's something that is always intriguing when I look at polls, whether there's as we find here in the States, a male-female gender split or an age difference. Those splits did not occur. The main difference, as we'll see as we go through the findings, were a difference between those who voted for the newly elected president and those who did not. And the difference there was itself a surprising one, because the voters who supported the new president were more hardline, less liberal, more inclined to support their country's nuclear program than those on the other side. I'm here today with Trita Parsi. Trita will give his expert analysis of the poll, but I would just say that initially the first finding I found that was intriguing to me was that this wasn't a green movement victory. Those who were either more liberal, more concerned with political reform, and in some cases those who simply think that the current government structure as it is set up cannot reform and won't make change. Those were the people who either didn't vote at all or voted for other candidates, or said that they weren't supportive or they didn't vote at all. Let's look at some of the findings. The first one I want to look at are the expectation issue. Those who voted for the president have higher expectations that change will occur than those who did not. When we ask the simple question, are you better off than you were 5 years ago, a split occurs. You can see that up on the poll here. The numbers were 36% said they were better off and 43% said that they were worse off. But those who look at the election of a new president, one that they supported, 65% of those who supported the president think that they'll be better off in the next 5 years. Only 13% don't. Overall, the country, 43% say that they are going to be better off and 27% worse off. Largely the result of the fact that the Rouhani anticipation of change is great. When we asked about political reforms, this is an interesting issue that we find in every time we poll in Iran, and other Arab countries other countries in the region, the Arab countries, are quite different. The top priority in Iran among Iranian voters is the issue of employment. It's going to be up on the screen in just a minute. Second is democracy, advancing democracy, then protecting personal and civil rights, then advancing women's rights, ending corruption, and political reform. 5 of the top 6 issues are political reform issues. It's the same, pretty much the same numbers as we found in 2011. We never see this in any other country in the region, even in the Arab countries that went through an Arab Spring, Egypt and Tunisia, etc. Many of the top tier issues are economic, healthcare, education, and structural issues involving bettering the quality of daily life. But in Iran, almost exclusively, 5 of the top 6 are political reform issues, indicating a real desire for change. Interestingly enough, the very bottom tier issues are resolving the nuclear standoff and ending sanctions, continuing the nuclear enrichment program, and improving relations with the United States. Now, let's just get a look at that for a minute, because when we look at the next slide that I've got up, which is the Iranian foreign policy issue, we find that Iranians are largely not supportive of the country's foreign adventures. When we ask them what they think motivates the country's foreign engagements, They don't think it's stability in the region. They don't think it's protecting the country's national security. They think 3/4 of them say it is protecting vulnerable Shia. But when we then look at the countries that Iran is engaged in particular Syria, Bahrain, Lebanon, and Iraq, countries almost split 50-50 down the middle. In the cases of Bahrain and Lebanon, conceivably, two of the more vulnerable Shia communities are the only ones where there is actual support, and that's only 50% support. But in Syria and Iraq, two of the more controversial areas of Iranian involvement, majorities are opposed, thinking that their country's involvement in both of those countries are negative. Not on the chart, but in the poll, you'll see the results if you go online and look for it. The only two countries where Iran's engagement is viewed somewhat positively, not overwhelmingly positively, are in Afghanistan and in Yemen. Now the question of the nuclear program, which I think again is really quite interesting because the results were somewhat different than I think many people might have expected. When we asked, do you support the nuclear program? Majority say yes. When we ask, should your country have a nuclear weapon? That's the slide that we're going to put up next. Should your country have a nuclear weapon? About 2/3 say yes. And less than 1/3 support the position of the spiritual leader, that the nuclear weapon is immoral and is something that we should not have. Only 29% say that. But 2/3 say yes, and the two reasons that they say yes is we're a major nation and we deserve the right to have one, and others have it, and therefore we should have it too. And then finally, when asked the question about sanctions, 96% say it's right to have the nuclear weapon, even if sanctions are taking a toll. It's worth the price of sanctions to have a nuclear weapons program, or a nuclear program, period. And when we ask about have they felt the impact of sanctions, only 36% say yes. Now let me look at this for a minute and just parse it out for a moment, and then I want to get Trita's reaction to it, because it's almost as if when you poll American voters and you ask them what are your rank issues in priority order, they're going to tell you education and healthcare and jobs and the economy, and maybe crime, et cetera, depending upon the area and the period of time. Sometimes immigration is right up there. The issue of guns, never going to even factor in at all. But when you push them on that issue, should you have the right to bear arms, this Second Amendment fervor takes hold, and a significant number will say yes. Or polling I've seen done on the Jewish community, when you ask them rank order priority of issues, Israel will come down like 1 or 2 or 3% will say, oh, that's the priority issue that I determined my vote on. But if you push them on the issue, if you push that button, then a different psychology takes hold. So too in Iran. If you're asking them what's the priority for you, the economy and then political reform and women's rights and et cetera, protecting civil and personal rights, but if you push them the button on the nuclear program, which only 6% say it's a priority, then a different nationalist fervor takes over and they become defensive about it. Yet sanctions aren't bothering us, we have a right to it. Bottom line here is that as negotiations continue, just as it's going to be a tough sell for President Obama here at home, it's going to be a tough sell for the president in Iran. And in particular because his constituency, those who he supports, who support him rather, are not totally sold on the fact that that they should disband this program. And one other thing, for those who suggest that Iran will take this deal, make a deal, but then use it to advance its negative engagement in Syria and Iraq, etc., the poll shows that Iranian voters aren't interested in that. They're actually interested in bringing issues back to home, building the economy, changing the country. It's almost as if, my sense would be, as I conclude, Trita, there's a kind of an exhaustion here. Enough of this stuff, let's build a country and let's be done with it. They're not interested in regional hegemony and all the rest. I'll end it there and turn it over to you.
One of the things I thought was very interesting in the poll, which I think starts to become a trend now, it differs from some of the previous polls that have been made, is that a couple of years ago when you polled them, while enrichment was still supported, perhaps not as high as 96%, that was also something that was very interesting, but it was always around 60 to 70%. Support for a weapon was never particularly high. We've now seen a trend in which more and more polls are showing that the idea of a weapon is actually being greater supported by the population. And I think it's a very worrying trend, but it's also one that actually was predicted, in the sense that if this pressure tactic of sanctions, etc., continue, and if there is a sense amongst the population and elsewhere that they're already paying the price for having a nuclear weapon because of all of these sanctions, they can end up with two conclusions, two negative ones, and of course there's other conclusions, but two negative ones. One being that if you're already paying the price for the weapon because of the sanctions, you might as well have the nuclear weapon. The second conclusion that they may be drawing, which also would be worrying, is that these sanctions would not have occurred if Iran did have a nuclear weapon. So if you are worried about the sanctions and you think that it has impacted the economy, then, and it's become worse and worse and worse, a conclusion drawn in which, well, if Iran actually had a nuclear weapon, it would not have to deal with some of these issues. I think that's a very worrying trend. I hope it reverses, and hopefully now, mindful of the fact that this was done before the deal, hopefully that trend will reverse, and people will find it valuable to actually strike a deal and give up some of these technologies.
It's almost as if the Netanyahu-Ahmadinejad pas de deux had an impact in both countries.
Absolutely.
Ahmadinejad caused a panic in Israel, but Netanyahu continues to cause a defensiveness and a bit of a backlash in Iran, so that the harsher the rhetoric, the more the defensive and supportive, but maybe with a deal, temperatures will calm down and people will see it's not worth the price.
Hardline politics feed off and encourage hardline politics on the other side, and vice versa. Ahmadinejad has done a tremendous amount of damage in making Netanyahu much more successful than he otherwise would have been in portraying Iran as an existential threat, which then today we've seen the repercussions of that with the Israeli public being so negative towards this deal, whereas the markets actually were not. But I think this was a worrying trend, but I thought it was very interesting to see a couple of other things, if I could just list a few of them. Looking at the countries that the Iranians would say that they would like Iran to emulate or move in the direction of. Turkey was ranking #1. The US was there, but it was slightly lower than Russia. But the one thing that was really interesting was that Egypt only got 1%. And I think there's a very clear reason for that, because Egypt has just had a revolution, and people are seeing it and they're not impressed. They've already had their own revolution and they don't seem to wish it upon anyone else, because they know that these revolutions tend to bring about very, very chaotic politics and usually get the country to move in a negative direction. That's not in any way, shape, or form, I think, a reflection of them supporting Mubarak or anything like that, but rather the process in which change is occurring. One of the things that happened this past summer that I saw on Facebook, which was very interesting, once the violence in Egypt was really reaching very high levels, and you should see supporters of Morsi being killed by some of the security forces, parts of Cairo was burning. Iranians were putting pictures of Cairo burning and these people being killed, and underneath it said revolution. Below that, they put a picture of people dancing in the streets during election night when Rouhani had won. And underneath that, they said reform. And I think that's part of the reason why Egypt is ranking only 1%, because at the end of the day, the population are not happy with their political situation, and the polls make that very clear. But the process... I found it interesting that when we ask, before the question about other countries you'd like to model, is your own country a model? Yeah. About half of Iranians say no. They said no. And throughout, the fact that they're so concerned about political freedoms, women's rights, etc., shows very clearly they're not happy with the political situation. But the process through which that they're seeking is not the one in Egypt or the one that they had in Iran before, but rather the one through reform, however painstakingly slow and problematic it is, and they're very frustrated by that too. And I think that, again, that's where the Turkey numbers being so high was very, very interesting. The other thing I thought was very interesting, mindful of the fact that there's always this critique against polls if you're making them in Iran, with the argument that, well, you know, if they're saying that they're supporting their nuclear program, it's because they don't dare to say something else, because the Iranians would be so terrified of expressing their true opinions, which we apparently automatically know without having done any polls. Well, the real hardcore criticism against the tenets of the regime, the population don't seem to have any problems expressing.
No, exactly. Yeah, go on.
The great disappointment with the political freedoms, women's rights, human rights, the pro-democracy, all of it is clearly there. Iran is not a model for other countries. They're discontent with so many different things. Those are issues that are far more sensitive, actually, for the regime than whether people support the enrichment program or not. And in fact, as you mentioned, while they say they support it, they also say it's not a high priority for them.
We presented these results at a forum in the Middle East, and what I found intriguing was that, and what participants found intriguing was that the honesty of about half saying our country's not a model for anybody else, and about half lacking confidence that the government could even make changes given the structural situation that they're in, and a significant majority pointing to not just improving the economy, but to political reform, women's rights, advancing democracy, et cetera, being the priorities for them, says to me this is a country dissatisfied and not afraid to speak its mind.
Not afraid to say.
Surprising, I think, for people on the outside, but a coward public doesn't say our country's not a model and we're upset with, including the fact that, you know, more than half saying that they find their involvement in Syria and Iraq to be negative.
Exactly. And if you add to that the fact that a much higher, I think 8% difference, said that they had greater confidence that the Israeli-Palestinian issue would get resolved and that the women's rights situation in Iran would get resolved. That's an interesting comparison. They had more confidence in the Israeli-Palestinian issue being resolved. It just shows a very clear criticism against the situation in the country and the policies of the government.
Are we taking questions online? Do we have any questions?
Yeah, not yet.
Okay. We're taking questions. If you email us or Twitter, it's at AAIUSA. We'd be more than happy to entertain your questions.
If I could add a couple of things that I thought was also very interesting. I mean, in this town, there is this now conventional wisdom that sanctions brought the Iranians to the table, that sanctions actually brought Rouhani's election victory. I see nothing in this poll that seems to support that idea. The fact that only 7% lists sanctions as a key priority for them, or that improvement of ties with the U.S. was a key priority for them, combined with the fact that they're saying that the price for continuing the enrichment program is actually worth it, 96% saying so. It does not give the impression that sanctions was some sort of a factor that caused people to vote for Rouhani. In fact, I think the poll shows very clearly that the election victory of Rouhani was a continuation of the Green Movement. It's the same issues. And when you see how he was campaigning in the country, he was using the language of the Green Movement. He was seeking out those voters, knowing very well that they are a very, very large portion of the population. Other polls have also showed that when asking Rouhani voters, why did you vote for Rouhani, only 2% in an open-ended question listed because he can lift sanctions. And that goes completely against the impression that seems to be in Washington.
Maybe three observations. First is, people who are on the more liberal end of things don't seem to have voted for him. They seem to be the folks who didn't vote at all. Number one. Number two, I think you're right to some extent about the sanctions not being the priority issue of why they voted for him, and not being the motivator behind their expectations. Part of that, I think, is this nationalism and defensiveness. That's one that they're not going to admit. But I think that tying together the other pieces of this, the more than 50% dissatisfied with Syria, the number one issue of the economy, he has a challenge right now, which is to say, I think you voted for me because you're exhausted.
8 years of Ahmadinejad and everything that's come before. We came out of an Iran-Iraq war that was deadly for everybody, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want to end the exhaustion. You want change at home. You want an improvement of the economy. He's got to tie that together with ending the nuclear program and ending sanctions. If he can't tie that together and turn the tide of public opinion in his country in favor of it, he's going to have a problem from hardliners, the very hardliners, some of whom supported him because they thought he was like the last gasp for the regime. And I think that therein lies a real problem. They may not be willing to admit it, but he's got to get them to understand that the way out of this box is to alter our behavior.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing that that's the movement that they're going in. 2 points on that. First of all, the most liberal elements, as you mentioned, did not vote for the Green movement in 2009 either.
Okay.
Those are people who, at the end of the day, essentially say they're not going to participate in these votes. They don't believe that this regime is in any way, shape, or form legitimate, and they're not going to participate in these things. So they've always been outside of it. It doesn't mean, incidentally, that the others believe that the regime is legitimate. It rather means that this is one of the most, risk-free avenues they have to try to get change by simply casting a vote. It doesn't mean that they accept the legitimacy of the regime by simply doing so. So I think that's important to understand. They're always outside of this. When it comes to, I think you're absolutely right, the population is exhausted. They're exhausted after 8 years of disastrous Ahmadinejad policies. Sanctions have definitely had a devastating effect on the economy. But the argument, the way that it's been simplified in Washington, which is that sanctions got them to vote for Rouhani, essentially would mean that had there not been sanctions, people would have been happy with another 8 years of Ahmadinejad-type candidates. That all of these other factors, the situation of women, the lack of democracy, the securitized atmosphere, all of that would have been completely okay had there not been for the pressure of the sanctions that kind of woke up the Iranian public and made them realize that they need to vote for someone else. And I think there's no evidence for that. There's nothing in this poll that indicates this, or in any other polls that indicates it. In fact, I think this poll shows exactly why this election was a continuation of 2009. In 2009, the regime cheated, they repressed the people, they made sure that the winners did not get to become the president. But in 2013, the wounds within the regime were so deep that had they tried to cheat once again, they would have just caused a complete collapse of it. And people realized it, and they took the opportunity, and they voted.
Let me just ask you two questions as we conclude. The first is, to what degree does public opinion matter? We see a poll here that if the regime is looking at these, they'll say, altering direction is an important thing for us to do right now. People are exhausted, they want change, and they want this kind of change, not that kind of change. They don't want us to do Syria. They don't want us to be meddling in Iraq. They want us to sort of pull back and build the country and have better relations with our neighbors, etc. Does public opinion matter? And secondly, is there, do you think, not related to the poll, if the public feels that way, does the regime itself feel that they're exhausted and that the isolation has been not worth it? Maybe not in dollars and cents, the sanctions, that can be debated, I suppose. I think it probably has taken a toll. But there's also this isolation. There's this sense of 8 years or more of having been seen as the regional rogue, and will it bring about a change in behavior in terms of the broader region and how they've behaved in the region?
Public opinion matters, but not necessarily in a way that it would be the decisive factor in this. At the end of the day, I would suspect that a lot of folks within the elite have very different opinions to why involvement in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. is important. And they probably think that the average person on the street does not fully understand the geopolitical implications of this. So their view on this is not something that they necessarily take into account. What I think they would probably more be likely to take account is the general sense of things going in the right direction and the wrong direction. But the specifics as to whether they should be involved in Syria or not, I think other factors probably outweigh the opinion of the public. But nevertheless, it is very important to note that the public is not content. A majority is not content with the direction. And incidentally, I would assume that it's pretty much the same way in many other areas. The public in Turkey is overwhelmingly opposed to the policy of the Turkish government in Syria, which is on the opposite side of Iran on this issue. I haven't seen any polls in Saudi Arabia, may be different, but the opposition to the Turkish government's policy in Syria is stronger than the opposition of the Iranian public to the Iranian government's policy in Syria. Syria, I think at the end of the day, most countries realize is there's no really winning and being involved in it. And when you have so many problems at home that the Iranians do, and the Iranians have far more problems at home than the Turks do right now, you obviously want to bring attention back home. When it comes to the other issue that the population is not content with this, or there's a sense of exhaustion, and there needs to be reorientation, I think we're seeing that they're moving in the direction of reorientation, but it's not in a way that they're reorienting and they're giving up their objectives. On the contrary, they're making sure that they're keeping their objectives while reorienting the foreign policy. So in the negotiations in Geneva, they made sure that their bottom line was respected. And for the first time, the West accepted the Iranian bottom line. So they're making the argument that we can achieve our objectives while pursuing a softer policy, rather than thinking that the only way to obtain your objective is by having this very harsh, confrontational approach that the Ahmadinejad government did. So I'm not seeing them changing their red lines. They're pursuing a better relationship with Saudi Arabia, but I don't think that is coming at the expense of Iran not playing a very strong role in Lebanon, in which the Saudis and the Iranians will continue to be competitors.
And I think that in the Gulf states, there's still a continuing concern that Iran is a meddlesome neighbor and a worrisome one, and they're a bit baffled and to some degree, especially on the Saudi side, frustrated with the fact that the United States has concluded a deal. But that's off the topic of the survey. I want to thank you, Trita, for joining us. I want to thank all of you for watching. Everything is available on aaiusa.org or on Zogby Research Services Twitter. It's at AAIUSA or at Zogby_research. You can get all of our polling data on both sites. Thank you, and let us know your comments.
Thank you.